Have you ever come back from a shoot and upon reviewing your images, they just didn't turn out as sharp as you had wanted? Well, don't worry, this happens to even the best of us, but I can assure you that after watching this video, you will have a better understanding of your camera settings and how to use them to take sharper photos in the future. Today, I'm going to share with you guys 2 crucial settings that will instantly help you take sharper photos. So if you guys are ready, let's jump right into it. The first setting you need to understand is aperture. Aperture controls how much light is let into your camera's sensor. For example, if you're shooting at a fast aperture at say f1.4, you're able to let in an adequate amount of light. The other equally important function of aperture is to increase or decrease the depth of field. For example, at a wide open aperture such as f1.4, the depth of field is considered shallow, meaning that subjects that are closer to the camera are more in focus and the subjects further away are out of focus. In the real world, if you shoot at a wide aperture, you can sometimes miss the focus. For example, in this picture of my dog, I shot wide open at f1.4 and it only seemed to focus on my dog's nose rather than their eyes or whole face, when in reality, you always want to have the eyes in focus if you're shooting any kind of living person or being. To give you guys a better understanding, let's take a look at my boy Tanjiro. So here we got Tanjiro. I shot this on my 35mm f1.4 GM. So for this test shoot, I shot in aperture priority with my minimum shutter speed at 1/250th of a second and my ISO on auto. So here we are at f1.4 and you can see that his eyes are in focus. It's a nice image, but if you look closely, like his jacket is out of focus, his katana is not in focus, and even like the edges of his hair, they're not in focus. And this is because shooting wide open at f1.4 in this example, the depth of field is considered to be very shallow. So you're only seeing the closest things to the camera. Those are what's going to be in focus. And the things that are further away is going to be out of focus. Now, when we stop down the aperture to 1.8, you compare right away, more of the background is starting to regain its contrast. You're starting to see more of a silhouette rather than just like a blurry background. And actually more of Tanjiro, like the outline of his figure is starting to pop out a little bit more, specifically around his hair. If you notice the settings, since my shutter speed is still at 1/250th of a second, the camera had to compensate the ISO by raising it from 250 to 400. That's because when you stop down, the aperture is closing down. Okay, if you imagine like this as your eye, if you're looking wide open, you see like a lot of light. You're letting in a lot of light to your eyes. But then if you start pinching your eyes, you're losing light. But if you do it to a certain extent, you are able to sharpen things and get things in focus. Okay, here we are at f2.8. So we have essentially stopped down even more. We went from 1.4 to 1.8 to 2.8, and everything is virtually the same. My shutter's still 1/250th of a second minimum in my aperture priority setting. And you can see that our ISO had to compensate from 400 to 1000. And that's again because we are closing the blades, letting in less light. Keep in mind though, even though we let in less light, we have essentially increased our depth of field. We've made it greater. So more things should be in focus. And if you compare f1.8 to f2.8, you can kind of see a big jump. So from 1.8 to 2.8, you can now see Tanjiro's jacket a little bit more clear. You see the details of it. His katana is starting to pop out, become a little bit more sharp. And the background is starting to become more clear, like what it is actually. If you're shooting wide open at 1.4, sometimes you don't even know where it is, what the setting is, because it's so blurred out. So you can also use aperture to achieve a certain creative look if you want to, include more of the background or take more of it out. Okay, going from 2.8, we are now at f4, f4.0. Shutter speed still at 2/50th of a second, and the ISO has now moved from 1000 to 2000. That's an extra 1000 ISO. From 2.8 to 4.0, now I'm starting to see, again, more of Tanjiro is becoming more and more in focus. And if you compare F4 to where we started at F1.4, you can see that essentially only Tanjiro's eyes, nose, eyebrows were in focus. Now going to F4, his whole body is starting to pop. Okay, let's keep going. From here, F4 to F5.6, and I kept the focus on the same area the whole time just to keep things consistent. And at F5.6, I see the details of his sandals, his socks, I see his blade, his jacket is becoming more in focus, and again, the background is starting to reveal itself even more. But you also see at F5.6 that my ISO is now 4000. Here we go from F5.6 to F8. F8 is, in my opinion, probably the sharpest looking out of the bunch. You have detail and clarity in the foreground, so everything leading up to Tanjiro's feet, and relatively in the background, kind of where you are. It's my studio. You see the acoustic panels on the side. Whereas at F1.4, you wouldn't even be able to tell that was a mic next to the window. So I usually try to shoot F8 when I'm doing landscape or nature because I really want to include the whole scene. Usually when you're doing portraits and stuff like that, low light, that's when you would typically shoot at a wide open aperture. And again, there's that case where people are going to be like, hey, why buy a f1.4 if you're not going to use it? Buying the f1.4 just to use f1.4 all the time is somewhat of a rookie mistake. However, there are times where f1.4 just shines, and on my 35 GM, even shooting at 1.4, everything is still tack sharp. The only things that are not sharp is just the areas that are not in focus. Okay, so we're gonna double this up, jumping from F8 to F16. And for this, somehow my camera kind of overrated itself in the aperture priority mode. It no longer stuck at 1/250th of a second, even though that's where I had it as a minimum shutter speed. So I don't know what happened there. And yeah, so we're at F16. My ISO, I set my ISO maximum when in auto ISO mode to be 12,800. I never want to go beyond that. And at that point, if I'm truly shooting low light, city life, low light, dark situations, most of the time I'm just exposing for the highlights. The second setting you need to understand when it comes to taking sharp photos is shutter speed. Shutter speed controls how fast your camera's shutter opens and closes. This is basically that snapping sensation you hear and feel whenever you take a photo. So here are two things to remember when it comes to shutter speed. A fast shutter speed reduces the light, and a slow shutter speed allows more light in. Also note that the faster the shutter speed, the more you are able to freeze the action of the subject. On the other hand, if you are shooting a moving object with a slow shutter, you will see more motion blur, which can result in a softer, less sharp looking photo. So to give you guys a better understanding, let's take a look at some photos I took of my brother hitting the heavy bag. You can see that with shutter speed, I'm at 1/20th of a second. So that's considered a somewhat of a slow shutter. You see already the amount of motion blur that is introduced into the image. Okay, so moving on to 1/60th of a second. So at 1/60th of a second, if you compare that to 1/20th, I feel like things are a little bit sharper. His eyes look a little bit more crisp. More of his gloves are starting to be caught onto the shots. So now we're at 1/125th of a second shutter speed. So we're starting to speed it up. We're starting to increase the speed at which the shutter, opens and closes. Therefore, the faster it shuts, the faster your shutter can click, the more you're able to freeze the shot, freeze the action while it's happening. In this case, we're at, again, 1/125th of a second, shooting at 35 mil. ISO at 100, and this time my aperture is at f4.5, because now as we are speeding up our shutter speed, okay, as we are speeding it up, we are reducing the amount of light coming into the sensor. So since we're reducing the amount of light, I have to introduce more light compensated to, balance out the exposure by opening up my aperture. So we started at f11 to f7.1. Now we're at f4.5. So jumping from 1/125th of a second, we are now at shutter speed 1/500th of a second. And this time I had to open up my aperture a bit more from, 4.5 to f2.5. So now things are looking crisp. The amount of times that his gloves are looking blurry are a lot less. And this is one of the main reasons, guys, that people will miss the shot. It's because they're shooting at a slow shutter to a moving target or a moving subject. Dynamic situations, cars, sports, models changing positions, dogs, pets. Almost everything you're going to photograph is going to be moving unless it's like a building or, something stationary, product photography. This case for my brother, as he was hitting the bag, I'm having a higher hit rate of catching him at a stop, like freezing the action as it happens because my shutter is fast enough to keep up with his movement. So we went from 1/500 to now 1/1600th of a second because our shutter is so fast. The amount of light that is hitting our sensor is so little. So now we compensated for that reduction of light by lowering our aperture and basically shooting wide open at f1.4. And if you look at the shots, to me, this is really great because my brother is in focus. The bag is in focus. I'm stopping him mid-punch, mid-strike, on impact on the bag, which is great. You kind of see those indentations and him kind of really following through with his punches. And the cool thing is that the background is blurred too. So this is kind of that cinematic standard that most people are looking for, keeping the focus on your subject and blurring out what is not necessarily adding to the image or, the emotion or the feeling that you want to convey. So guys, for moving subjects, dynamic situations, cars, sports, pets, you want to make sure that you're shooting at a correct shutter speed that's going to match the speed of the movement you're trying to catch. Unless you're trying to go for some stylistic representation. Now that you guys know the two most important settings for sharp photos, let's talk about some bonus tips that will help improve the sharpness in your photos. A few bonus tips for sharper photos is to shoot at your camera's lowest base ISO. For most cameras, that would be ISO 100. Shooting at a higher ISO in comparison can introduce a lot of digital noise to your image, which may result in a less sharp looking photo. Another important tip is to use some method of stabilization, as any movement to your camera from shooting handheld can result in you missing the shot or introduce unwanted blur, again resulting in a softer looking image. One last tip would be to get specific with your camera's focus area. For example, if you set your camera's focus area to wide, there are times where you could be trying to photograph a human subject, but instead of shooting them in focus, some random area of the background is mistakenly selected to be in focus. For me, if my subject is very clear and distinguishable, I'm fine to shoot in the wide area setting. If I want to focus on a specific area of my subject, I will oftentimes use small spot tracking. With small spot tracking, I can pinpoint the exact area that I want in focus, half press the shutter, and the focus will stay locked on my target, allowing me to adjust my composition if necessary. With all this information at hand, I'm confident you guys will be able to achieve sharper looking images. Remember, aperture and shutter speed are the two most important factors that will help you achieve a sharp image. If you understand those two settings alone, you will have more control of the creative look of your image. Thank you guys for tuning in and supporting this channel. Links to all the gear I use in the description box down below. Until the next video, peace out.